Thanks. So yeah, I'm gonna on this first one, I'm gonna get started and just sort of walk you guys through what we've been thinking about this concept of agile science. And in particular, basically, I'm going to talk through what's the need and then what makes it agile and scientific at a very high level, sort of the whys and the whats, if you will. And then Pedj is going to jump more into details on some hows. Okay, so first let's start with the need. I'll just start by saying I love science. I think science is awesome. It's done all sorts of cool things for us in the world. And that's very inspiring to me. I think that science plays a role in trying to advance society moving forward. And I think there's a great need for it too, particularly thinking of all the things that are going on in our society right now. Weight, obviously, childhood depression and wealth inequality, global warming. I think we actually have a very important role to play in this. And so one of the things we were trying to think through is, well, how do we actually get our science to be able to, work on these hard, intractable problems? And in particular, sort of thinking about like what is their sort of certain standard practice. I'm sure you've heard this, the 17-year quote. But I'm just going to quickly run through like how might that happen? This isn't the only way it would happen, but just bear with me. And I'm going to talk incredibly fast like a New Yorker, just as you guys already know this, right? So let's do this. So scientists is curious, they read some stuff, they develop a study idea, they do an IRB approval, they gather some data, they write a grant, they receive reviews, they rewrite the grant, they review second time, they receive funding, they eventually conduct their study, they write a paper, they submit paper for review, they receive reviews, they rewrite the paper, they resubmit papers for review, the paper gets accepted, paper gets published, scientists read it, clinicians, policymakers meet it, and then maybe care changes. Right? That's what we're currently doing? Do we want, that seems like maybe a problem, right? So how do we make this more agile is sort of the question, right? And so that's sort of how we've been playing through this. And so I want to set this up with a comparison. This is Dana. I'm going to be telling you a lot more about Dana Lewis in this. The other talk was just mine. But the long story short about Dana is she is a patient with type 1 diabetes. And long story short, she built her own artificial pancreas system, open sourced it online. Now there's about 800 people who have used the scripts that she developed to have their own artificial pancreas system. I'll tell you more about her later. But the short summary here is we are not waiting. That's a key phrase for the community that she helped to develop. Basically, what can we solve now? And how can we make progress now? And in particular, this is very important for us. And again, I'll get into this later. But it's very important for us to think about the potential unintended consequences of what we do. Very concretely, a patient with type 1 diabetes can go to bed every night and not wake up the next morning. Why? Because type 1 diabetes can kill you. Your glucose goes too low, you die. So literally every night before she built this system, she was scared that she was not going to wake up in the morning. She had a night where she actually, every morning, she always called her parents to let them know that she woke up. And one night she didn't call. And literally her parents had a heart attack. It was a horrible experience. She went, and all she wanted was basically a louder alarm system to help wake her up. She's a very heavy sleeper. She went to a continuous glucose monitoring company and basically said, can I do this? Can you basically make this louder? And they said, I'm sorry, we can't do that, because if we did that, it would mess with the results from our randomized controlled trial. Because our system would therefore be different, and therefore it would not be FDA approved. So I'm sorry, but we can't make that tweak for you. The next trial we run, yes, we will add that feature in. But you guys know how you just saw the 17 years, right? So you can see the logic of we are not waiting. So something that we've been trying to think about is how do we balance these two things? And at a high level, you can sort of think about, we're trying to figure out how do we match needs of patients, providers, policymakers with the tools that we have. And I'll get into this later on the different ways of using data. But so that is sort of agile science at a high level. And we sort of think conceptually, what we want to do is we want to be producing usable evidence, which is a concept that Pedro will go into great detail about, efficiently produced, applicable, and build in a modular fashion. And we care a lot about modules. Particularly, Pedro is going to dig into the usable evidence and modularity quite a bit. But I'm just going to hit on what makes it agile and what makes it science. So what makes it agile? Have you guys ever heard this phrase or this quote from Bill Gates? He basically says, a lot of people underestimate how much we can do in 10, but overestimate how much you can do in 1 year. Have you ever heard that phrase? I think I flipped it actually. But basically we think we can do an awful lot in 1 year that we can't, and then we don't realize just how much we can pull off in 10. As a concrete example of this, do you know what happened in 2008, just as a reference? Android came out. So it has been 10 years since Android devices exist today. So that's kind of interesting. How much has changed in those 10 years? Would we have predicted that? Probably not, right? So playing on this idea of, of sort of 1 year and 10 years, this actually builds on, you hear the word Agile software development. Another sister idea of this is lean development. So this is an idea from lean. Basically, the idea is, and you can see the sort of pithy way of saying it is focus on 6 months and 10 years and forget about the rest. Now that's pretty sacrilegious from everything we're talking about from a grant standpoint. So I recognize that a lot of this is aspirational, but we're sort of asking the question of how might our science be different to solve these wicked complex problems, right? So the way it works in lean is basically you can do one model where you try to build the components of a car and nobody's happy until you build a car, right? Or you can do is you can build a skateboard and somebody's happy. You then make it into a scooter and a few more people are happy, and then a bicycle, a motorcycle, and eventually you get to a car. And people are happy every step of the way. This is exactly how Dana's community actually developed an artificial pancreas system. Basically, the first question was, the first 6 months was basically, let's get data off of the continuous glucose monitor. They figured that out. The next one was, let's make an alarm loud enough so that Dana could go to bed at night and feel like she was safe. Took about 6 months. Then she was like, it does math really well, computers. Why don't I let it do the math of what the doctors told me to do? Get the computer to think about that. 6 months. Then she's like, you know what? This thing's making some really good decisions. Why do I have to be involved in this loop? Close the loop. There's your artificial pancreas system. So focus on 6 months, 10 years, forget about the rest. You can do an awful lot with that. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wow, that's really dangerous and whatnot. I'll come back to that in the second half, because I think there's actually some very interesting questions we should be thinking about from a safety standpoint. But also note, this is not, and I know that Facebook is not in many ways probably a good thing to highlight, but arguably a lot of things that get created in our world and have an impact follow this general model of you have an initial idea and then you slowly take over the world. So, or not, you die, but that actually you have that as a structure to think about, okay? So one half of it is basically focus on 6 months and 10 years, forget the rest. The other part of what makes it agile is really trying to solve problems through networks versus hierarchies. Why? Because no one person at this point can have a full understanding of the needs and the tools that are needed, right? And so it becomes a matchmaking service, back to that point before, right? And in many ways, that's what Dana and her community did, right? Dana has a bachelor's in communications. Some people are surprised. How did you build an artificial pancreas with a communications degree? I can tell you why. She's a good communicator. She knew how to make an ask so that she could find the people who had the tools to help, and then build a community who would work well together. And so there's also this book on New Power that discusses a different way of how we solve things, rather than hierarchy in a network fashion. Basically, it's the idea of rather than thinking of power as a currency, thinking of it as a current, something that flows. There's goods, there's bads for this, but that's a key part of this thinking. So now finally, what makes it science, right? And I think this is probably what we all normally feel comfortable with, right? So in brief, a key thing that we've been kind of obsessed about is this difference from a causal inference or a statistical inference to actually a causal model. And what do I mean by this? This is a concept that Shadish, Cook, and Campbell described a while ago, and if you're a behaviorist, the causal descriptive versus causal explanatory models. Basically, imagine most of our science today is sort of like flicking a switch 1,000 times. And we basically want to figure out, if I flick this switch, does a light turn on? This is valuable. This is good to know. This is, basically, I can make a prediction that if I do this, then that will happen, right? But notice it is just an if statement. It doesn't tell you anything about how or why, right? A causal explanatory model, or as we were thinking, a causal model, actually tells you how it happened. So water falls over a pit. It turns an electrode, right? I won't go through the whole thing, but you can get the idea. Flows through the electricity. You close that switch. What that does is allows electricity to flow up into a light bulb. If it's an old one, it has a noble gas and a tungsten filament. As it goes through that tungsten filament, it produces light through resistance, right? Now I understood how. So in many ways, one of the key things that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about is how do we better fully engage with the logic of causal models instead of causal inference. We think most of our science is basically built around the idea of a causal inference, and by extension, interventions as our structure on how we know things. But we think we actually should be moving towards causal models where every intervention is not an intervention, it is actually an experimental manipulation of a much, yeah, I'm seeing Melissa smile, I'm like, yeah. There it is, right? So let me unpack that a little bit more statistically, right? Like, this is the way we think about generalization often, right? Statistical generalization. We have a sample, and then there's a study population, and then there's a target population. But what if people, place, and time matter? You know, if that is true for your causal model and you don't have it specified, you're not actually fully studying the causal claim. You know, so you can basically say there might be preconditions. So this is one where, let's say you send a text message to tell someone to go for a walk. They're probably only going to go for a walk if they have the opportunity to walk, and if they're maybe not all that stressed, and maybe if there's a friend around who wants to go for a walk with them. Right? That is actually part of the causal claim. So a precondition really matters. Now, the other part is thinking about this causally as a causal model. Now, notice here, we're being very distinct about the difference between a theory and a causal model. For us, a causal model is closer to an operations, right? Where it's literally like this. You send a text message, and what happens next? Well, they have to read it, and maybe appreciate it, and then maybe they decide to act or not, and then maybe they walk for 10 minutes, right? And now you can just see that's the structure of a micro-randomization trial, which is a trial that was just published, but that's another conversation. But then there's this feedback loop. So basically, there's a causal pathway that's moving forward. There's a series of steps that need to happen. But then there's also preconditions that matter, right? So this is a complex causal model that's basically saying, if I send you a really simple intervention, a text message to go for a walk, what exactly is happening? And can you draw it out in a way, and can you measure it? Maybe you can't measure all of it, but the more we get closer to this versus having just a black box where we don't know what happened, will hopefully allow us to actually advance our science. So that's a causal model. Now, there's even more fun with this, and so this is right from UCLA, Judea-Pearl. I strongly, strongly urge you to read this book, The Book of Why. Key to Pearl's work is basically trying to think through how do we advance a more robust language of causality, and sort of working through when are we thinking in an associational terms, intervention versus counterfactual terms. It's awesome. I'm not going to get into it, but central to it is drawing out causal models and diagrams. So this is actually a classic from public health, snow, right, where you basically shut off the water supply and seeing how that works. He kind of works through how you could articulate a causal claim from observational data. Here's another one. There's basically Fisher actually was just big on this idea of a smoking gene, and therefore it makes it not actually testable from a randomized controlled trial perspective. And so basically showing how, if you actually had a causal model structure, you could actually work through, does this actually hold water with the data we have available? And the key for this is this concept of called the do calculus. And the idea is that you ultimately get down to this idea called an estimate, which is basically something that you can actually say, this is my mathematical statement of the causal claim. And what you can do is then say, does my data allow me to actually test this estimate? If you can't make a causal claim. If you can make a causal claim. And there's a whole lot more to it. But at a high level, I'm just setting up this idea that there's actually a very interesting and robust language that's forming around causality that is different than a causal inference, which is basically bound only in RCT, and as a causal model that allows you to think more broadly about causality. So finally, to summarize this, what makes it agile? From linear to agile, managing uncertainty and using baby steps to solve these complex problems via iteration. From hierarchical networks, solving problems via diverse, connected people with agency, matching needs and tools. What makes it science? Moving from general insights to precision. You can see this in the preconditions. Science grounded in when, where, for whom, and in what state. And then finally, from targeting statistical generalization to targeting causal models. Every experiment is actually a part of a causal model that you can work out. And then putting this all together, we really think, as we've kind of worked through this, we actually think that science should be mapped more on how evolution works than as a linear process. Why? Evolution is a great solver of problems, right? You have a whole bunch of genetic variability. It gets naturally selected for given niches. If that works really well, it's niche expansion. And those are basically the three phases as we think about it: the create, optimize, and reuse structurally. Creation for us is really what is success and what is the niche, using solutions to actually help you to understand that. Once you have that, you can think about that as human-centered design roughly, but there's other CVPR and other sort of approaches, right? Once you actually know or have a good enough sense on what is success in the niche, you can engineer the hell out of it, basically. That is where optimization comes into play, where you can keep trying out the solutions and basically try to get to success. Once you have success, a useful tool, just like Facebook starting at Harvard, then going to Stanford and slowly taking over the world, you ask where else might this be useful? And you actually have a science of generalization to guide you with that. Pearl calls it transportability, but we can come back to that later. So this is sort of the process. We've been trying to basically think through how science could work more like evolution to solve problems. Now note, this isn't clearly an applied science. We are trying to solve problems. This is not about basic science, and so any claims that we're setting up here have absolutely nothing to do with the basic science. If you guys want to make connections, that's fine, but that's not what we're talking about. So, passing over now to Pejam. How do you actually do this?
So Eric presented some of the big ideas behind Agile science. I'm going to try to bring it down a little bit in terms of abstraction to sort of show you how this applies to the kind of work we're doing in this institute and the kinds of interventions we're building in our own work. And so I'm going to start with an example. And this is to give you a flavor why this approach that we're using might be potentially useful to you in your own work. So let's say you've been looking at the literature and you came across this concept of a glanceable display. There's this source comes out of HCI, but it's been making its way to behavioral science as well, which is that you have a display that is always visible. And to most of us in this room at this point, probably the closest representation of that is a watch face, right? When you watch something where we have ambient information every time you take a look at the watch. So the first, and this comes out of sort of the notion of ambient displays in computer science, but Causal in mid-2000s created a system called Ubifit, which basically tried to use this concept to promote physical activity. And this little garden display on the phone was basically blooming as you walked and ran and did other kinds of exercises that were captured by a wearable sensor. And basically the feedback was presented on the phone. What's key about this is that you didn't actually have to go into an app to look at the feedback. Every time you pull the phone out of your pocket, you would see the representation of how active you were. And this changed over the course of the day, the more active. We ran a 3-month study of this thing, and we found that actually basically a version of the intervention that had this glanceable display worked better than the version of the same intervention that had the logging application and the wearable sensors, but did not have this display. A few other people then picked up on this work. Tansin Chaudhry and Dick Lane did a version of this in 2011 called Be Well that also sort of expanded the range of the feedback to include social interactions and sleep and things like that. And there are now several projects that you basically try to use this notion of a glanceable display mostly to promote wellness activities like physical activity and social. This thing on the bottom here is a system called mHealth that Eric developed while he was a postdoc at Stanford, and I'll talk more about it. So you look at this literature and you say, this is an interesting concept. I'm actually really interested in thinking, can I use this to help people manage stress, right? It's a different, the literature has no instance of this particular concept being used to support stress management. You want to know, based on the literature, right? Is this worthwhile, right? Would you actually want to, if you were to build a system to help people manage stress that had a glanceable display, is this likely to work, right? To answer that question, before just putting a bunch of development resources into building a system, then deploying it out in the world and seeing, does this actually work? What would be nice is to actually have some information from the literature that you get. And particularly, what would you want to know about the glanceable display? Well, you want to know what kind of average effect size it has, right? Does this thing, how well do these things work together, right? You want to know, do they work equally well or differently for different kinds of behaviors, right? Does it work equally well for physical activity as it does for sleep? Because if there were 5 or 6 behaviors that were tested in the literature, and the effect sizes are roughly the same, you can make a reasonable assumption that it's probably going to work reasonably well for stress as well. You want to know, does the design of the display matter, right? I mean, how this information is presented. Is that something that you need to worry about? You want to know whether you need to provide feedback both on the actual activity or goal attainment, right? So because in the literature, different glanceable displays did this differently. You also want to know at what granularity the feedback needs to be represented. Do you need to have some kind of a sensor that can measure the behavior you're trying to support in real time, or can you use something like EMA multiple times a day, and is that going to be good enough, right? Does the location of the display matter? Does it work equally well when it's on the phone versus on the watch versus on a big screen in the room? Like, these are the kinds of things that are really helpful if they were in the literature to help you make a decision for a new intervention you're trying to create. Is this something that is worth appropriating, right? What kind of people these kinds of displays matter and so on. The problem is that for the most part, it's really hard to extract this kind of information from the literature right now, right? Well, if you think about how we evaluate systems, this is not what you get, right? What you really want to know is from the literature, you want to know about the evidence for the components that were implemented, and you want to know how that evidence is bounded, right? For whom it worked and in what circumstances it worked, and what mechanisms of action these components were trying to activate. Because without that, it's really hard to take the information that you saw in the literature and apply it to your own problem, right? So that's actually one of the things that we're trying to solve with Agile science, right? So we came up with this notion of usable evidence that really refers to the kinds of evidence that we should be collecting through our studies that allows much easier transferability from one project to another and for building of an evidence base over time across projects, right? And so what really a big part of what we have been thinking about is what are the requirements for building this kind of evidence that allows you to answer the kinds of questions that I was presenting earlier, so that you can in a very sort of reasonable way start with the literature and have good assumptions about how a particular component is going to work in your own system. So what is needed for this? There are three things that three particular points I want to talk to you about today. One is that we really want to be focusing on assessing individual intervention components and not systems as a whole. The other one is that you really want to focus on proximal outcomes, and I'll come back to define what those are. And then finally, to make all of this agile, we want to be focusing on efficient experimental designs. And I'll go through those in the rest of the talk. But just to note that, as Eric was saying, I mean, Agile science covers a larger ground, but one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about is this first step of sort of how you start with a niche, with the problem that you're faced with, and come up with a whole bunch of versions of an intervention that you might might be representing the kind of intervention you want to deploy. We have a lot of materials about this that we have developed over the last few years, and they're all available on Agile Science website. But what I want to do in the rest of this talk is really focus on this more methodological and part of sort of what you should be studying to build the kind of evidence that allow you to then make that evidence useful both to your own future projects and to other people in the community. So let's start with individual intervention components. So this is mHealth. This is one of the systems that I was discussing. And like many of our interventions, it has a whole bunch of components, right? So it has a self-monitoring pieces where it allows you to see how active you've been over the course of weeks and months. It has passive activity tracking through a wearable sensor. It provides some reinforcements. It provides problem-solving strategies for people. There is a glanceable display, so the whole screen that you see is providing feedback on how the members of your team could be inactive. There's a message board and also some social norms feedback. It's a thoughtfully designed intervention, and typically, if this was evaluated as we normally evaluate health interventions, what we would do is we would run an RCT, compare mHealth to some kind of a control condition, and try to see, like, does mHealth work better or for supporting physical activity, right? What we don't know if we were to do this is, well, and let's say we get a positive result. Let's say mHealth works well, right? What you don't know is which components contributed to the effectiveness, right? You don't know what mechanisms actually were being activated, and you don't know, does it matter whether the particular design in this particular case mattered or not, right? Bonnie had some assumptions about her systems that in some cases the design might not matter, in other times it actually might matter. It's really hard to tell from an RCT whether that's the case or not. So, but if you wanted to really create the kind of evidence that I was describing, it really helps to try to figure out which of the components in this particular complex system will work, right? Can you actually get some knowledge for individual pieces of mHealth and try to see which of those was being useful, how they interacted, and what mechanism each one of those things was activating. What that allows you to do is to tease out the contributions of individual components of a complex system, so you can sort of decompose what is happening mechanistically. You can also understand how different components are interacting. Does one component only work when it's in the presence of another component, right? Or are some components actually butting heads, right? You can also potentially test different designs of a single component, and some of the studies that we're running lately with these micro-randomized trials are really intended to answer some of the questions around, if I were to design this particular component in this way versus that way, does one of those works better? And just in this system hard steps that I have been developing for supporting physical activity, for example, one of the things we found in the last study is for daily planning. If we randomized between a version of daily planning where people had to every night write a new plan about how they would be acting on the next day, and in another version of that same intervention with the same kind of prompts of how will you be active tomorrow, they could just pick from a list of things that they could, or plans that they had previously made, because most of our lives are routinized. So you basically, we end up, even when you force people to write a new plan every time, they often write the same plan that they wrote before. Writing a new plan adds about 900 steps a day over not writing up, not the plan. The picking from a list doesn't do a damn thing, right? So both of these are the same construct, but how it's designed ended up making a difference. So focusing on individual component can actually help unpack this kind of stuff. Right? In order to do that, though, you really need to have a way to assess a single component. And this notion of proximal outcome, and you will be hearing more about that from Billy tomorrow, is as well, is really key here. And one way to think about proximal outcomes, and this came up in Bonnie's talk as well, is that really you can think of it as the most immediate intended effect of a single dose of an intervention component. Okay? Now, what you consider a dose will vary by your system, right? Sometimes, if you, let's say you have a system that's intended to increase, let's say, self-efficacy, and you really think that something like 2 or 3 text messages a day is the least sort of the smallest dose of text messages where you would see some kind of a change in self-efficacy. Well, then there's sort of a weekly dose of these text messages is your dose, right? So you would randomize potentially between weeks when you send people those text messages and weeks when you don't. But your proximal outcome is going to be the change in self-efficacy at the end of the week, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be for a single text message. It's whatever is the meaningful dose within the system that you're creating, right? But the idea here is that it's something that is directly linked to the administration of a single component. So as a sort of dummy example, let's say you have a simple desktop program that pops up a message after you've been sitting for 45 minutes to prompt you to stand up, like Yona is doing right now, right? In that case, your proximal outcome, a reasonable proximal outcome is, did you stand up, right? That's the thing that this thing was supposed to accomplish, and so that's really the target. It's not sort of the total amount of sedentary time over the course of a month. That's your distal outcome that you're after. What the proximal outcome is did you get up after the message was provided, right? One way to think about these proximal outcomes is that they're really mediators of the distal outcomes that you're trying to affect, right? And conceptually, I sort of distinguish between 2 versions of that. You can sort of think of these kinds of behavioral proximal outcomes like standing up or going for a short walk as a micro versions of the distal outcomes that you're trying to influence. So, for example, about 15 minutes walking is a micro version of a habit of 10,000 steps a day, right? So it's a small version of the same thing. And many of the proximal outcomes will have that form. That is not the only type, right? Other intervention components might actually have proximal outcomes that are very different than the final thing that you care about, right? So let's say you're developing an intervention for helping people not relapse with drinking, right? There is rich literature showing that the rich social connections with people who are supportive of your abstinence are helpful with helping prevent relapse. If you have some kind of a component within your system that is intended to increase the communication that a person in recovery is having with friends and family members, well, for that particular intervention component, measuring the number of interactions with family members and friends is a reasonable proximal outcome. What you care in the long term is still the abstinence, right? You're still caring about the relapse prevention, and that might be a distal outcome. But for that particular component, really the thing that is the most direct outcome of that component working correctly is that there is an increase in communication with abstinence-supporting family and friends, right? So different components within the same system can have different proximal outcomes. That is okay. That allows you to actually study whether the components are doing what they're supposed to do. And so purely sort of to figure out where these things sit, if you think about this kind of a long causal models from an administration of an intervention that you're developing to the final distal outcomes that we're trying to affect, so cardiovascular health or something like that, really the proximal outcomes sit sort of over there on the left, right? They're right after the administration of an intervention, and they're mediating the change towards the distal health outcomes that we're trying to influence. What makes for a good proximal outcome? Well, first of all, they should be in the causal pathway, right, towards the distal outcome you're trying to affect. If your proximal outcomes are not doing anything for the distal health outcomes you care about, what's the point, right? Then you should be rethinking your intervention component. You should be able to impact those proximal outcomes and measure them after an administration of a dose of an intervention component. And In the best case, so this also means that they should be measurable, right? You need to be able to measure those proximal outcomes at the time scale that is meaningful for that intervention component, right? So again, for something like a little suggestion to go for a walk that Eric was describing, we have a proximal outcome that is passively measured. We look at the step count in the 30 minutes following that intervention. Other times you might need some self-report, such as self-efficacy, and that needs to be, but it needs to be, you need to be able to get that at the time scale which is meaningful for that component, right? And finally, I mean, in the best case scenario, what you also want is proximal outcomes that can allow you to see whether the mechanism that you think this intervention component is working through is actually being activated. So you can sort of think about a set of proximal outcomes that you can examine, some of which are behavioral, right? Is the person going for a walk? Other ones are more about trying to assess mechanisms, and some of those mechanisms might be sort of cognitive states that you're trying to get at through self-report or other means, right? So, but if you have proximal outcomes mapped for all of the intervention components, then what you're able to do is in a single study get all kinds of evidence about each one of those intervention components and their interactions, right? And efficient study designs allow you to do this, right? And in this, we draw heavily on Linda Collins's work on most, and really we're talking here about many of the optimization trial designs that you've already heard about in this institute, and that Billy will be going into detail tomorrow. But just very briefly, to just see how this ends up working out in relation to these intervention components, factorial designs are a prime way that this kind of work can get done, right? So in a factorial design, you randomize participants to cells that represent different combinations of levels of the components you're trying to study, all right? And then what that allows you to do is to study multiple of these components concurrently, right? And then to both assess the main effects of each component as well as interactions of those factors. What is important from the perspective of this talk is that as we were discussing, even in a standard factorial design, you can distinguish between the outcomes that each of those components is supposed to affect. That might be different, as well as a common distal outcome of which we might be able to compare the components set as a whole to make judgments about which to incorporate into the final event, right? So these are the components, some of the components at 20 miles, and as you can see for the glycable display, maybe the social comparison was actually the right kind of proximal response. For right features, it's the self-efficacy, which is brought into EMA, and then for message board, it's the social cohesion. All of them are intended to support physical activity, right? And you can compare those factors in terms of how well they're affecting physical activity, but you'll also be able to tell, are they actually going through the mechanisms that you're postulating they should be working through? Micro-randomized trials allows you to do this with the intervention components that are repeatedly delivered, right? So things like text messages and reminders and things of that sort. And in a micro-randomized trial, you randomize the delivery of one of those intervention components at each decision point. So at each time that when that particular component may be delivered. And this depends on your theory and so the prior experience, what the right decision points are. But basically, that in terms of, and Billy will be talking more about MRTs tomorrow. But the basic idea is that every time you have an opportunity to send a particular intervention. So let's say for a reminder for hypertensive medications that might be once a day. So for that particular component, every single day you would randomize whether you send the component or not, or which version of the component you send, right? And then you would try to capture the proximal outcome for that administration of the component, right? So the person take the pill. As well as, and this is really the key piece here for going back to Eric's notion that the context matters for whether an intervention works or not. What you want to capture is all the various contextual factors that you think might determine whether that intervention would be effective, all right? So in this case, you might want to know where the location that the person is at. You might want to know what the time of the day is and things of that sort. And then what this allows you to do is to model the component's time-varying causal effects, right? You can actually tell whether that particular component is working in general, right? Averaging over the whole study, whether that effect changes over time, and then just as importantly, how the effect is moderated by context, right? So it might be that that your reminders for medication adherence work really well when people are at home. right? Because the pills that are nearby, they get a reminder, they go take the pill, and it works well. They might not work very well when they're out and about at all, right? And if you know that, then when you're designing your intervention, you can actually put the decision rules in place to basically only deliver it at times when they're likely to be effective and not burden people at other times, right? So just to reiterate here, the randomization is done at each decision point, and during the study, a person can be randomized many times, right? And you would randomize each component that is micro-randomized separately. So basically, as with other vectorial designs, you can study multiple components at the same time. And you can randomize whether a component is delivered or not, what version of component is delivered, or some combination of those two. So in these studies of hard steps that I did, for planning, we would basically randomize each night. We would randomize whether we ask you to plan at all. And then if we did ask you to plan, then we would randomize whether we would ask you to create a new plan or do a plan that or pick from a list of previous plans, right? So that kind of the randomization structure works as well. So it gives you a lot of flexibility for being able to see how a particular component is working and how that changes over time. So just to summarize, right, we should aim for evidence that maximizes our knowledge accumulation and reuse. And this is really a sort of a key thing that has been driving a lot of the Agile science work that we have been doing, is that we want to be able to take something we have learned from one study and apply that in the next study, whether that next study is being done by us or someone else, right? And we think that that's really for that to maximize the possibility of doing that, we want to be focusing on individual components and then potentially, and as we move forward, on constructs underlying those components in a really robust way where we have these causal models that can be created based on the data that we've received to see how well those intervention components and constructs that underlie them are working and in what context they're working improperly, right? So that you get this really nice bounded knowledge that is based around individual components that can be then repurposed for other systems. So many of you will sort of be asking this question, how is this different than most, right? And just to start, we absolutely adore most. Most is awesome, and I think Linda has been doing some really great work in making bringing this notion of optimization into behavioral science. We both most and Agile science is really committed to rigorous creation and preparation of interventions. We're both really focused on this notion of optimization as a key way that we both think about intervention development as well as evaluation. And really, we hold many of the same guiding principles. So this notion of continuous evaluation and optimization as well as resource efficiency are both key to most and Agile science. There are some differences, though, and where we think we're extending most in some ways. One is that, and this did not come quite as clearly in this talk is that we really focus, bringing this work from user-centered design and human-computer interaction, we're really focused on, in early stages of development, on ideation and highly iterative development, where we create many versions of interventions, both to try to understand, do we have a good understanding of what the underlying constructs are? And we do that by basically trying to come up with multiple ways to operationalize that construct as an intervention, as well as to basically be able to use all of this evidence that is accumulated from user-centered design, that iterative design really creates better products. So we really focus heavily on iteration and parallel prototyping at the front part of the development process. But in terms of the actual evidence, I think there are a few key differences here. One is that from our perspective, evidence about components is the actual end goal that we are after. Right? We want to know how individual components are working, how those constructs underlying those components are working, and we want to study that directly, right? The way it's typically presented still focuses on the development of complex multi-component interventions, in optimizing those things and then putting those in a confirmatory trial that eventually will produce evidence about the effectiveness and efficacy of that intervention, right? That is great, and I think that evidence is really important. But in terms of how we're building the evidence base within behavioral science, we think that there is a lot to be said for the evidence base that's built at the level of individual components, and that's a key distinction. The other piece is that the way that we are thinking through this research process is that we really want to be focusing on the testing of causal models, right? We want to be able to get evidence about underlying mechanisms within these studies, so we can tell how individual components are actually working. And finally, we see RCTs as another way that we can get information about individual components, and in certain contexts, RCTs are really efficient for doing optimization, and not necessarily only as a final stage of a confirmatory trial method that only gets you the evidence about a complex intervention, right? So if you're running online experiments where getting a whole bunch of people is really, really easy, right? If you're Fitbit, an RCT is a perfectly fine way to do optimization, right? And so we really think of RCT as another kind of tool that we can use to do this kind of continuous. So that's Agile science in a nutshell, and we'll take any questions you guys have.